Mute. All right. Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the question and answer session for Tebogo Atkins' film, Days of Cannibalism. Tebogo, thanks for a beautiful, complex, and I would like to say mature film. It was very impressive to watch it, albeit on a computer screen for the second time. It was as beautiful. I'd like to start off with a general question. You are in many ways a global citizen. You grew up partly in South Africa, partly in Lesotho. You've lived for extensive periods in France. You've lived in China for brief periods, and you're now living in Berlin. And you've also had a daughter in Berlin recently. And I'm just wondering, most of your films seem to have been made in Lesotho. And I was wondering whether you could speak about your relationship to Lesotho, both as in a personal manner, but also as a venue for filming, often long distance from where you're living. If you could maybe chat about that a bit.
Okay. Thanks for the kind words. Lesotho is really special to me because somehow Lesotho is it's compressed, you know, it's like a whole country and it's very small, but the whole sort of systems of a country are compressed into a small environment, so it's quite easy to navigate. And say you want to film a jail, you know where to go to speak to magistrates, you know, you kind of like, I really know how to negotiate my way through the structures in Lesotho, and that's possibly why it's really fruitful. And what I find really interesting about Lesotho is that, for instance, with the whole sort of China-Africa question, sort of, because Lesotho is in some ways quite remote because it's close by South Africa, you can sort of see big things that happen all over Africa, but on a very small scale. So, for instance, in this film, it was not important for me that it's Lesotho actually, or that the film takes place in Tabatseka. That's why I didn't have the name of the town anywhere, you know. It's meant to be a sort of anonymous place, which could be anywhere really. So Lesotho kind of, it's everything, and it's kind of just works for me on so many levels. And you know, I speak the language, and I have deep connection to the place, so I really feel at home there. Yeah.
Okay. Yet your film is at the same time very much dominated by the landscape and the very particular landscape of Lesotho. So I'm just wondering if I could ask about some of the kind of choices around representation in the film. Your colleague, Lebogang Jeremiah Mosese, said in a Q&A once that he finds that the beauty and the grandeur of Lesotho's landscape is almost tyrannical and almost oppressive. And that's why he tries to shoot either in a square format or in a 4:3 format, so as to not sort of succumb to the beauty of the landscape. Your film is shot in widescreen. It's, you know, really does show us the beauty and the stark beauty of the landscape. But yet I'm interested to know about your coloring decisions, particularly when comparing this film to your previous film, Coming of Age, which was very lush, very obviously beautiful, very green. I mean, the look of Days of Cannibalism is very washed out, it's very desaturated, it's got a very different emotional feel. So I was just wondering what your choices behind that might be.
I think it's actually because we shot in winter. I decided to shoot the film in winter, and there's a kind of special quality in the light in Lesotho, and it's an atmosphere of harshness and sort of the purity of light and absence of color, which I find really inspiring. So the entire film is shot in winter, and there are a few scenes which we filmed in summer and we kind of changed them to look like we shot them in winter. So we took out all the green, all the lushness. And why CinemaScope? I mean, there's a whole kind of thing behind that. But I wanted to make Western. You know, the film is meant to be contemporary documentary Western. And the CinemaScope is maybe kind of the first and very most obvious hint or clue onto why the film is Western. Sort of like it's the kind of invites the audience into the space, and what we found quite interesting is how the CinemaScope, because my protagonists live in different places somehow. I mean, the horsemen live in the wide open landscapes, and the Chinese have built themselves little enclosed, kind of almost like a fort, in the mountains, with these metal structures, and it's all quite oppressive and claustrophobic. And to shoot this oppressive space in CinemaScope, coupled with the wideness of the landscape within the horsemen, which the horsemen move in, gives a really strong contrast on how these two tribes live in the same space, And so the CinemaScope works quite differently with the different protagonists, I feel. I mean, I'm over theorizing and over intellectualizing a bit. I mean, I don't know what it felt like for you, but I found that very surprising how this big decision, this big CinemaScope, gives a different effect on the different characters.
Okay. Now we can maybe come back to that, because what I found interesting is how the film plays between, I mean, I suppose what you could call a kind of a grand cinema aesthetic on the one hand, particularly with the exterior shots, and then very much a verite aesthetic with a lot of the shooting inside the shops and so on, or inside the court, for example.
Or in China as well, right? I mean, to shoot CinemaScope in this little hotels, it's quite a bold choice,
So maybe, I mean, like, how did you conceive of applying this kind of verite style with the CinemaScope format?
Well, I mean, you mean how did we go about directing it, or?
No. I was interested. I mean, because usually verite is associated with a kind of a more documentary type format. It's not usually associated. I mean, it's kind of a stereotype, but it's not associated with cinema in the same way. So I was just wondering how because you do have a very, I think the CinemaScope, I mean, in the money you said, almost accentuates the verite aspect of the interior shots.
Well, I think the film is very controlled. The directing, or the way the scenes are built, is very focused, and quite sparse. So like 2 or 3 shots build a scene, and one knows exactly what one is shooting. So we didn't shoot very much, and every time we were about to film a scene or create a scene, we talked about it a bit before, like we kind of went about this documentary in a fiction way. We sort of knew what we wanted to shoot and how, and then we kind of like, I don't want to say molded the reality, but sort of focused our gaze on the reality to fulfill the expectations of what we're looking for.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in conceiving of the film as a Western, I mean, how can you maybe expand on that a bit more? I mean, I know you've spoken about how the Western is about life on a frontier where the power relations are still being negotiated. That's one thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But I'm also thinking in terms of the, I mean, in terms of scripting it as with a kind of a model with certain narrative rules. I mean, how did you approach it from that perspective?
Well, I think it's sort of, I like this idea of putting a genre into a documentary, like and then breaking the genre within the documentary. Like with one of my my gangster project film, I wanted to make a genre gangster film, documentary gangster film. So I come and try to make a gangster film as one sort of imagines it in the genre, and then it breaks and crumbles as the film progresses, and it sort of helps me, because I have no protagonists, I have no story, there's no plot, so it really helps to have a kind of an idea of how to frame it, and then by saying I want to make a Western, immediately that helps me and the cameraman understand what we're looking for, and so I mean, it's formally the film's a Western because of the space, the landscape, and how we treat the landscape, and about the fact that it's a kind of a frontier border space. It's the pioneers arrived, the settlers, there's the kind of the indigenous community that is being upset by the power, and the power balance is being shifted, and so all these little clues, come together to make a Western. And when you make, because I mean the film, it's sort of, it's not an improvisation, but I mean we're exploring and creating the film as we go along. So it really helps us to have a few kind of sets of rules or like a toolkit at the beginning to help us focus what we're making. Because I mean we're not following a single person where there's no conflict that a character is going through or anything like that, And it's easy to get really lost in this space and with all these people that one meets and these difficult situations. So we kind of kept on saying, okay, so how would a Western film this? How if we're making Western, or what's a Western solution to this situation? Yeah.
Because I'm also interested, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion, particularly with the rise of the so-called hybrid documentary or the docu-fiction format. There's been a lot of questioning of traditional barriers or distinctions between documentary and fiction. And it's also, in many ways, become quite fashionable to, kind of to make films that do blend documentary and fiction with, to my mind, often varying results. I mean, there's, as you know, there's festivals that particularly focus on films that blur these boundaries as well. So I'm interested, but, your film is dealing with quite a complex and very politically contested phenomenon, the idea of xenophobia on the one hand, and then possibly the possibility of Chinese expansionism across Africa. And it's a complex debate, with kind of, there's not many clear answers. And I'm interested in the idea of documentary, kind of taking formal approaches to solving difficult social issues. So I'm wondering whether you were conscious of that when you took the Western as a way, I mean, rather than kind of going for a format which tried to find an objective sort of viewpoint with different views, you actually imposed a third element upon this debate, which I found was very interesting. Was that a decision or?
Well, I mean, like you say, it's problematic, right? I mean, like, how playful can you be with real people, with real situations, with real problems? Huh? I think that's sort of that's the basis of the issue, and how to negotiate these realities and represent these realities. So I mean there are two things here. I mean I think the whole documentary fiction thing is a bit of an old debate, I mean, like, when always, like, it's quite clear that the moment you put a camera in a room, it focuses on something and doesn't give back the whole reality, right? It sort of is already that there's a choice there, and a fictionalization of reality, if you will. So I think it comes more down to the kind of the integrity of the filmmaker and matters of respect. How do you respect your characters and their situations? And almost it's more of a kind of a moral responsibility you have, where you kind of, so that, like, documentary fiction doesn't really matter, but how do you respect your characters in the right way? In the same way that a fictional film can be completely disrespectful to its characters, and that doesn't work either, and likewise, a documentary film, you have a certain obligation towards people with whom you make the film, or the reality as you understand it. And I'm constantly, and that's the classical documentary approach, is sort of this process of being with people and understanding their reality and their struggles, and this empathy that one is trying to make in the film. And I try to find the balance by spending as much time with the one camp, the Chinese, as well as the Basotho, yeah.
Because I must say, the documentary, I mean, we've had this discussion previously, but the documentary fiction relationship is something that I grapple with a lot, and I have for years on a whole number of levels. I mean, I'm currently involved in a project which I guess I should describe as a fictionalized documentary. It's presented as a documentary, but it's almost entirely fictional. It's not about real people. the thing for me is I still, I mean, you know, cinema is cinema. You have genuine emotional experiences when you look at a piece of pure fiction because it resonates with human reality and it's in some way based on human realities. There's no creativity is possible, no film is possible that's not in some way based on human experience or social experience. Yet at the same time, I find it very tough to say that, you know, it's all the same, that there's not a difference. There's for me, there's still a very distinct sense of a reality kick when you feel that, wow, the camera was there, this really happened. And obviously this is something that is then stylistically implemented, you know, so you, for example, and then fiction films borrow that style from documentary. If you look at films or TV series like NYPD Blues, when it started off, it had a very kind of like verite aesthetic, and people felt almost that it had more emotional, more, I guess, real world power because it looked like documentary. So I'm interested very much in this idea of code exchanges or what codes are referenced. And what's kind of, I suppose, what's interesting about your film is that you don't acknowledge, you know, you don't give signposts for what is fiction and what is not. I mean, you leave it to the audience to guess, which I guess is, and I'd just like to know how you approach that. A conscious thing, not having any kind of signposting, or how did you conceive of that?
Well, for me, the film is documentary. You know, if you ask me, I'd say it's a film, and then it's a documentary film, and because there's a kind of it's people being themselves, whoever they are themselves. You know, and no one is acting to be somebody else. You know, if like the court scene, for instance, is directed, right? But everyone is themselves, and that's sort of the essence. You know, and this question of, I think it's a the documentary fiction debate. I think it also really depends on the. I think every film, like for instance, the other film that's showing at the festival, I think is For Selma, right? And there, for instance, you know, it's really important to know that this all really happened. You know, like it would be quite devastating if it was acted, you know, or if somehow it was fictionalized. And it's a film where the documentary experience of the person who made the film is really, really, really important. But then there are other films where it's not important, you know, and I think the debate is, it's really specific for individual films, right? I mean, like it's, like, you know.
Okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't kind of like say, you know, put any big one answer fits all. You know, it's sort of, some films have an obligation to reality, others don't have an obligation to reality, and it depends how the filmmaker makes that happen in the film.
Okay. Right? So I guess what I'm interested in your film is as with many of these films, is how, to what degree does the film rely on the codes of documentaries? So, I mean, for example, the courtroom sequence, and I presume the discussion between the two guys working at the Capitol as well, that was to some degree kind of reenacting themselves or reenacting a conversation that they might have had. And I'm just wondering, you've made the decision to kind of recreate something that's real, based in real life, and you're making it happen, but you choose to shoot it in a quite, in some way, aesthetically limited documentary style. I mean, you could have come in with lights and changed angles. And so, I mean, the fact that it's, I mean, what does that documentary code mean? I mean, you are shooting, you are invoking the kind of spirit or the aesthetics of documentary, even while it's in a way a fiction, or not a fictionalized, but a kind of a controlled, authored version of reality. So, I mean, how did you think through that, or how did you conceive of that?
I didn't treat these scenes differently to any other scenes in the film. You know, like if I tell an actor, my protagonist, like, go over there and we're going to film you, you know, as you stand behind the cashier in that shop and do your job, you know. It's also a directed, it's directing someone within a documentary way. So you know, for this particular film, I did not. I mean, in other films, maybe I think it's important to make a point, you know, like in my other film, there's a scene where kind of the gangster film, I think, you know, right? and where they kind of rob me, you know, and I kind of do a counter shot there, kind of to show that it's directed, but where I don't see the necessity to do it. I don't think it would make this. I don't think it would. The question's important in this film, whether the scene is directed or not, except for the CCTV scene, right? The attack, you know, because that's, you know, there's a question there whether that's real or not, because it looks so crazy, you know, with the little girl and in this scene it was important for me to show that it is actually real, and I did that by showing that, you know, by taking it out of the CinemaScope and putting it into the 16:9, you know, and kind of really showing that this is different to what to the rest of the film we saw, you know, and to kind of eliminate that question when you see that. Yeah.
So robberies are a theme and endings in your films, it seems.
Yeah, they're all gangster films. Yeah.
Okay. Because I mean, I think that's going, because I mean the final, that brings me back to the same theme, because I think the final scene, there's a kind of such a stark eruption of the real in that final scene that it almost it's almost as if it's like saying you know, ultimately this is a real story. It almost clinches the reality value of the
But there's an interesting story behind that scene, actually, and that's because it was getting really quite difficult to continue working with the Chinese community, because they didn't really know what we wanted, you know, and like often it was a bit awkward, and so we kind of like, and we didn't know what to film because there's really not much happening in their lives, right? I mean, they just work and that's it, you know, work, and then they have their little evening gatherings, and this not much, and they didn't have time to play with us. They didn't have time to go out and create scenes with us, so they were not interested in engaging with us in that way, in comparison to some Basuto protagonists. So it was 4:30, just before the World Cup final of 2018, and we thought, you know, okay, you know, maybe we'll go and hang out with them and we'll watch football together, and you know, something will happen. And I was really just sort of like, you know, we really need a scene because we're leaving the next day, and you know, maybe we'll just watch football, and you know, it'd be great. So we kind of stood around there awkwardly, waiting for the match to begin, and then we all just got attacked, you know, and what happened, you see, and my prayers were answered, no, in mysterious ways. Yeah.
Okay.
So
we've got a question from the audience. How did you choose the name for the film? Could you maybe?
Good question. Yeah, good question.
Add to that and ask, you know, is there any kind of, given the history, or at least the history of Lesotho, is there any reference to historical, you know, kind of events?
Cannibals. Yeah, that's a good question. The name of the title of the film is a bold choice, right? I mean, and quite maybe a bit problematic, but it was because it sort of feels loaded, right? You kind of think, okay, so if it's called Days of Cannibalism, then who are the cannibals and who are the people being eaten, right? And one can sort of see it as kind of a bias towards or against the Chinese, perhaps. But in fact, it just comes from the name of a small bar called Days of Cannibalism, where we were hanging out a lot. And he called his bar Days of Cannibalism because there's a lot of jealousy in the community when he's building his bar, and so he kind of poetically decided to call it, you know, Days of Cannibalism. And sometimes I wonder if we should have kind of, I don't know, put a photograph of the bar, you know, to kind of make people understand that this is actually a real place. But I do have it in the credits, you know. I say thank you to Soft and his bar, Days of Cannibalism. But yeah.
Because it's almost a kind of one of those fortuitous thing where a decision in the film gets so many more meanings, even though you possibly don't intend.
I know, exactly. It was just like, yeah, and it had a nice ring to it, you know, and it's a bit sexy as a title as well, you know, which is kind of one remembers it, you know, but it often gives the wrong impression. But yeah, it's a heavy title, right? But it's okay. It's good.
But I even thought, even at level, because when I'm watching the film, you start thinking about human-animal relationship in a much deeper way as well. I mean, what does cannibalism mean in terms of our relationships to animals, and how does our kind of treatment of animals relate, or what does it kind of tell us about human ethics or human interactions as well? So it actually resonated for me in a whole
Also, I mean, a big part of it is that's why I'm quite interested in stock theft, actually, because I mean, you know, in Basotho culture, the cow is very important, and in a way, it's an extension of one's personhood, right? You become a bigger part of the community through your animals. You know, like having cows is like, if you're rich and you invested in, I don't know, a 4-wheel drive and 2 houses, it's selfish wealth. But if you invest in cattle, it's money that the community can participate in. It's an extension of your personhood. You know, you are part of the society or the people through your animals. So if animals are stolen, you know, you're cannibalizing a part of someone. You know, so in fact that's what got me thinking and interested in this whole idea of stock theft and what stock theft meant in the mountains. And then I found it, and then it was really interesting when you know, I kind of understood what cattle are and what it resonates. And a cow is not like you know, a cow has more than just 2,000 rand, right? There's a whole kind of metaphorical and symbolic value around the animal. But when I discovered that the Chinese are investing in cattle as well, you know, it was really interesting because that strips the cow of all its symbolic value, and it just becomes a price per kilogram of meat. And it's a demystifying this traditional economic coin of the place, you know, and that's also an act of capitalist cannibalism, if you want. You know, yeah. So one can kind of spin it in quite in many ways. Yeah.
And then if I've got one more broad question, just to get back to the idea of the verite form of the film. I mean, what really works for me in the film is actually the verite style storytelling. I mean, you often have long shots that basically with cuts that function on sound. A lot of the editing functions on sound transitions. I mean, there's very little music. The kind of sound cuts is actually what drives a lot of the meaning and emotion of the film. So I'm quite interested to know, I mean, you spoke about that you had a rough plan, you had the idea of a Western, and you kind of formed things and planned shots as they went along. But I'm just wondering to what degree was the film scripted? Because it seems to me that, you know, what the achievement of the film for me is exactly the open-endedness and the way that you are juxtaposing different scenes and different realities without a meta commentary. You're not giving an interpretation. There's extreme openness. I mean, you refuse to kind of give answers, which for me is one of the strongest elements of the film. Yet I'm wondering, how does that relate to the fact that the film seems to be more authored than a verite film would normally be? I mean, I'm just interested in how you get a script that you work towards.
Well, the script is just like this, the kind of what I just told you about cannibalism, the way I explained and understood cannibalism, and that's the script, really, you know. So okay, cannibalism, stock theft, court scene, Chinese owning cattle, you know, and then kind of, and then for instance the scene in the police station, you know, this really beautiful scene with the young horse thief and his uncle who comes and tells him off, you know, which looks like perfectly scripted fictional scene. And it's entirely documentary. I mean, there's really there's like nothing in there that's fictionalized at all. But it's just the way it's filmed and kind of the mise en scène and the timing of everything and the dialogue. You know, it's just kind of spot on. But that's documentary. So I think kind of it's basically maybe a classical essay film in the sense that one thought process leads to the other, right? And then you kind of meander through these spaces and you kind of build up characters, but the moment we started making a plot, it was going in the wrong direction, because then we started trying to tell a story, and that took away the magic of the scenes that existed as separate islands within the space, you know. So it's a film about spaces more than characters.
Okay.
And then the spaces help you control the authorship, you know, the directing, the writing of the film.
So it's almost as if the I don't know, fictionality is not the right word, but the authorship comes out in individual scenes rather than an overall intent or an
exactly.
Okay.
And that's why, I mean, we filmed it over a number of years, right? I mean, like, I think we filmed over 3-4 years, so every time we'd film, like, more scenes would kind of develop organically. But that's also partly why we have no characters, because in 3 years, your characters move on and disappear. So yeah.
But I think that was something, that kind of not naming of places, the not naming of names. I think that was, for me, one of the things that really.
And you're never quite sure as well, where the Chinese are, where the police station is, and it doesn't really matter, It's just sort of this space in the middle of nowhere, or in the middle of the mountains, rather, And the moment we started trying to build it up, saying, okay, so the police station is a half-day drive from this place, and they're kind of like trying to make it understandable, it lost some of the magic, Yeah. And you haven't spoken about the beginning, the China part, right?
It's interesting. When I first watched the film, I expected you to bookend the film on both sides. I mean,
right. Yeah.
To China. But then, as with many other elements, I found the film a lot more, I don't know if accessible is the word, but I went with it. I was engaged with it a lot more on a second viewing. I think a lot of things made more sense. And I think it is a complex film. It is a film that does make a lot better sense on a second viewing. And I was just wondering, as the last question, I mean, I know it took you a long time to get this film funded and made. I think it was 5-6 years, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm just wondering, what are the funding dynamics and then distribution dynamics of trying to make a film of this kind? And I guess particularly in terms of trying to make a film that doesn't fit a clear category of, storyboard documentary or creative documentary, as is normally funded, or a fiction on the other side. So, I mean, what are the financial costs, I guess, for a film?
Few. Yeah, I mean, that's why we ended up mostly getting French money, because France is very kind of open when it comes to documentary, and they have but when you apply for money in France, you have to write a lot. It's always done on the dossier. So the more you write, the more scenes you create in your head, the more you kind of imagine the film before. The writing is really important, and it's no matter if it's a fiction or a documentary. So that's partly why French films are so kind of cerebral, because they've been written over many years. Even the documentary has been written over many years to receive the funding. And in a way, it doesn't make sense, right? I mean, you write this kind of a story for 3 years and you get the money, and the reality has changed. But it does kind of make you, I don't know, think about the film in different ways before making it. So it was funded through these. What was interesting, it's not funded through documentary funds, actually. It's funded through fiction funds as much as through documentary funds. Like the grant we got in France is for debut feature-length films, be it fiction or documentary, and the money we got in Holland as well. So, and I was quite proud of that I wasn't kind of put into either box, and I thought that was important. But I don't know if I'll be able to find that money for, let's say, another project like this. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe a final thought. What is next on the cards for you, other than looking after a small child?
I'm going to make another genre documentary, maybe a horror genre this time. I don't know, but that's sort of an idea that's bouncing through my head a bit.
Okay. Also shooting Lesotho? Or?
No, I think not this time. Not this time. Maybe South Africa, or maybe here in Berlin. I'm not sure yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you made films in Berlin?
I made films during the studies, and short documentaries, but I haven't made a big film.
It'd be interesting to see what you do, if you do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Bit intimidated, maybe.
Well, I think our time is pretty much up, and I don't think we've got any more questions from the audience. But thank you very much.
Thank you for your thoughtful questions, and I'm glad the film got better on the second viewing.
No, that's great. Again.
Cool. Thanks a lot.
Danke,
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.